The coffee was still steaming when Captain Sarah Chen made the impossible shot that would rewrite military history. At exactly 3,347 meters, over 2 miles away, her bullet found its target through the reinforced canopy of an F-22 Raptor, threading between hydraulic lines and armor plating to neutralize the hijacker inside. But 12 hours earlier, she was just another face in the crowd, invisible to the very people whose lives she would soon save. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada sun had barely crested the horizon when Sarah Chen pulled her battered Honda Civic into the visitor parking lot of Nellis Air Force Base. At 28, she possessed the kind of unremarkable presence that made security guards glance right past her average height, black hair pulled into a practical bun, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans that had seen better days. Her only distinguishing feature was a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose, giving her the appearance of a graduate student rather than someone who held 3 marksmanship records that would never appear in any official documentation. Sarah had driven 6 hours through the desert from her small apartment in Bakersfield, where she worked the night shift at a 24-hour veterinary clinic. The job paid just enough to cover rent and allowed her to maintain the low profile she'd cultivated since leaving the Army 3 years earlier. Few people knew that the quiet woman who stayed late to comfort injured animals had once been Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, callsign Ghostwire, whose precision with a rifle had earned her a reputation among the most elite circles of military special operations. She was here because of a phone call that had changed everything. Her younger sister, Lieutenant Amy Chen, had been selected for the Air Force's experimental pilot program, one of only 12 women chosen to train on the newest generation of fighter aircraft. Amy had always been the golden child, the one who soared through flight school while Sarah had quietly excelled in ways that couldn't be celebrated publicly. Today was Amy's final evaluation flight, the test that would determine whether she'd earn her wings and a spot in an elite fighter squadron. The base buzzed with activity as Sarah made her way through the security checkpoint. F-22 Raptors screamed overhead in formation, their engines creating thunder that rattled windows and reminded everyone present of American air superiority. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency between aircraft, and pilots in flight suits strode purposefully toward their briefings. The smell of jet fuel and desert heat created an atmosphere of controlled chaos that Sarah remembered from her own military days. Though her service had been very different from this gleaming display of air power, Sarah found her way to the designated observation area, a small section of bleachers positioned behind reinforced glass where families were permitted to watch training flights. The area was surprisingly crowded. Parents, spouses, and siblings had traveled from across the country to witness their loved one's milestone moment. Sarah took a seat in the back row, preferring to remain unnoticed while she scanned the crowd and the surrounding area out of habit. The other families chattered excitedly about their pilots, sharing stories of flight school adventures and career aspirations. Sarah listened quietly, occasionally nodding when someone made eye contact, but mostly focusing on the flight line where crews were preparing the aircraft for the day's evaluations. She spotted Amy in the distance, easily recognizable even in her flight suit and helmet, going through pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had always characterized her approach to everything. Colonel Marcus Webb, the squadron commander overseeing the evaluations, addressed the gathered families through a microphone. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with the kind of commanding presence that filled rooms and demanded attention. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what we consider the most challenging evaluation in military aviation. Your pilots will be tested on air-to-air combat, precision bombing, and emergency procedures that will push both them and their aircraft to absolute limits. The F-22 Raptor represents the pinnacle of American air superiority, and only the most exceptional pilots earn the right to fly it in combat. The crowd murmured appreciatively, parents beaming with pride at their children's achievements. Sarah remained silent, her trained eye already cataloging potential security vulnerabilities and escape routes, habits that civilian life hadn't entirely erased. She noticed the positioning of security personnel, the sight lines from surrounding buildings, and the general lack of awareness among the observers who were focused entirely on the spectacle before them. I should mention, Colonel Webb continued, that this particular group of evaluations is historic. For the first time, we have female pilots competing for positions in our premier fighter squadrons. This represents a significant step forward in military aviation, though I'll be honest with you, the standards remain unchanged. Excellence has no gender, but it also shows no mercy. Sarah caught the subtle emphasis in his words, the suggestion that while women were being given an opportunity, expectations remained skeptical. She'd heard variations of this speech throughout her military career, the patronizing acknowledgement of progress wrapped in doubt about women's capabilities. It was a familiar frustration that had driven her to prove herself repeatedly, often exceeding standards that male soldiers were merely expected to meet. The first group of pilots began their flights, and Sarah watched Amy climb into her F-22 with the confidence that had always defined her sister. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the focus and determination in Amy's movements as she went through her final pre-flight procedures. The aircraft itself was magnificent, a technological marvel that represented decades of engineering advancement and billions of dollars in development costs. As the morning progressed, Sarah became aware of conversations happening around her that reflected the same skepticism Colonel Webb had barely concealed. Major Robert Hayes, one of the evaluation instructors, was speaking quietly to a group of senior officers near the observation area. "Look, I'm not saying women can't fly," Hayes said, his voice carrying just far enough for Sarah to overhear. "But there's a difference between flying and fighting. When you're pulling 7 gigaseconds in a combat situation with enemy missiles tracking you, physical strength and reaction time become critical factors. There's a reason these positions have traditionally been male-dominated." Sergeant First Class David Rodriguez, a stocky man with sergeant stripes who appeared to be involved in aircraft maintenance, nodded in agreement. "My daughter wanted to be a fighter pilot when she was younger. I told her to focus on transport or cargo planes, something more suitable. These jets are weapons of war, not opportunities for social experimentation." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with hearing her own capabilities and those of women like her dismissed so casually. She'd spent years proving that precision, intelligence, and mental fortitude could overcome physical disadvantages, but the conversation continued around her as if she weren't even present. Captain Jennifer Walsh, a young intelligence officer, joined the conversation with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was eager to be accepted by her male colleagues. "I think it's admirable that they want to try, but realistically, when lives are on the line, we need to prioritize mission effectiveness over political correctness. The enemy isn't going to care about diversity initiatives when they're shooting at our pilots." The dismissive tone struck Sarah as particularly grating coming from another woman, but she remained silent, focusing instead on Amy's performance in the air. Her sister was executing maneuvers with the kind of precision that should have impressed even the most skeptical observers, but Sarah could see from the body language of the instructors that they were looking for reasons to criticize, rather than acknowledge excellence. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a civilian contractor working on pilot psychological evaluations, leaned into the conversation with the confidence of someone who believed her academic credentials provided insight into combat effectiveness. The research on stress response patterns shows significant differences between male and female pilots under extreme conditions. Women tend to experience higher cortisol levels during combat scenarios, which can impair decision-making capabilities when split-second choices determine mission success or failure. Sarah had heard enough pseudo-scientific justification for gender discrimination to last several lifetimes. She'd also lived through enough actual combat to know that courage, skill, and mental toughness weren't determined by chromosomes or hormone levels. But challenging these assumptions would only draw unwanted attention to herself, so she continued to observe in silence, while frustration built steadily in her chest. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the Flight Operations Center. Several officers were rushing toward communication equipment, their urgent movements suggesting something significant was developing. Colonel Webb's expression grew serious as he received updates through his headset, and Sarah's trained instincts immediately went on high alert. "We have a developing situation," came an announcement over the base loudspeakers. "All training flights are being recalled immediately. This is not a drill. All personnel not directly involved in flight operations should remain in designated areas until further notice." The gathered families looked around nervously, unsure whether this was part of the evaluation or something more serious. Sarah watched the activity on the flight line intensify as ground crews moved with new urgency, and additional security personnel appeared at strategic positions around the airfield. Amy's F-22 was among those being recalled, and Sarah could see her sister's aircraft approaching the runway for an early landing. But something felt wrong about the entire situation. The level of alert seemed disproportionate to a routine training interruption, and Sarah's combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts when conventional explanations didn't match observed reality. Major Hayes was speaking rapidly into his radio, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by professional tension. Quote, "Confirm the nature of the security threat. Are we dealing with hostile aircraft in our airspace? What's the source of the alert?" Sarah strained to hear the response, but the communication was too distant and fragmented to understand clearly. What she could observe was the systematic way base security was positioning itself, and the fact that several officers were now looking toward the civilian observation area, with expressions that suggested the families might need to be moved to more secure locations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Webb announced, "we're implementing enhanced security protocols as a precautionary measure. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of base personnel. This is likely a routine response to increased threat levels in the region, but we take all security matters seriously." Sarah's professional assessment was that the situation was anything but routine. The rapid response, the urgent communications, and the way senior officers were coordinating suggested an active and immediate threat. Her civilian clothes and unremarkable appearance made her invisible to the military personnel managing the crisis, but her trained eye was cataloging details that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. As Amy's F-22 touched down on the runway, Sarah noticed additional aircraft approaching from the horizon, helicopters that didn't match the standard Air Force inventory she was familiar with. The situation was evolving rapidly, and her instincts were telling her that the morning's flight evaluations were about to become something far more dangerous. The crowd around her continued to chatter nervously about the interruption to the planned activities, but Sarah remained focused on the tactical situation developing before them. Whatever was happening at Nellis Air Force Base was bigger than a routine security drill, and she had a growing suspicion that her unremarkable presence in the observation area might soon become very relevant indeed. Colonel Webb's radio crackled with urgent communication that Sarah couldn't quite make out, but his expression told her everything she needed to know. The situation was escalating, and the base was preparing for something that went far beyond the evaluation flights that had brought all these families to Nevada. As ground crews rushed to secure the returning aircraft, Sarah found herself automatically assessing sightlines, cover positions, and potential tactical advantages from their current location. These were instincts that civilian life hadn't diminished, habits of observation and analysis that had kept her alive in situations where others had not been so fortunate. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, casting harsh shadows across the airfield where Sarah Chen sat among families who had come to witness their loved ones' achievements. None of them realized that within hours, the quiet woman in the back row would demonstrate capabilities that would forever change how the military viewed women in combat roles. But that demonstration would come at a cost that no one could yet imagine, and under circumstances that would test not just Sarah's extraordinary marksmanship skills, but her ability to remain invisible in a world that was about to discover exactly what she was capable of accomplishing when American lives hung in the balance. The helicopters on the horizon grew larger, and Sarah's trained eye began to distinguish details that filled her with growing alarm. These weren't routine military aircraft responding to a standard security alert. They were something else entirely, and their approach patterns suggested intentions that had nothing to do with supporting the base's operations. Major Hayes was now speaking rapidly into multiple radios, coordinating responses that confirmed Sarah's assessment that the situation had moved far beyond a training exercise. The families around her were beginning to sense the tension, though they lacked the context to understand what they were witnessing. "Attention all personnel," came another announcement. "We are implementing Code Red security protocols. All civilian visitors must be escorted to secure locations immediately. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of base security personnel." Sarah watched as uniformed guards began moving toward the observation area, their expressions professional but urgent. The morning that had started with flight evaluations and family pride was rapidly becoming something that would test everyone present in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. As the first security officer approached the civilian seating area, Sarah made a decision that would set in motion the events that would reveal her true capabilities. Instead of waiting to be escorted to safety with the other families, she quietly slipped away from the group and began moving toward a position that would give her a better view of the developing situation. Her movement was subtle, practiced, and completely unnoticed by people whose attention was focused on the obvious drama unfolding before them. But Sarah had learned long ago that the most dangerous threats often came from directions that no one was watching, and her instincts were telling her that the real test of the day was just beginning. The visiting families were about to discover that sometimes the most important person in a crisis was the one everyone had overlooked, and that the quiet woman who had driven 6 hours to watch her sister's flight evaluation possessed skills that could mean the difference between life and death for everyone on the base. Major Hayes continued coordinating the response to what was clearly becoming a significant security threat, but none of the base personnel had yet noticed that one of the civilian visitors had positioned herself where she could observe and potentially influence whatever was about to unfold. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years building a civilian life that allowed her to remain invisible to the military establishment that had once depended on her exceptional abilities. But as the helicopters approached Nellis Air Force Base with unknown intentions, her carefully constructed anonymity was about to be shattered by circumstances that would force her to reveal skills that were supposed to remain buried forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine what everyone present thought they knew about women in combat, about the price of excellence, and about the deadly precision that could be achieved by someone the world had learned to overlook. The morning sun continued its climb over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows that would soon conceal movements and positions that could determine the fate of everyone at Nellis Air Force Base. Sarah Chen had arrived as a supportive sister wanting to witness Amy's achievement, but she was about to become something far more significant in a crisis that would test every skill she'd ever learned and every boundary she'd ever accepted. As the unknown helicopters grew larger on the horizon and base security moved to implement emergency protocols, Sarah found herself calculating distances, assessing targets, and preparing for possibilities that the other civilian observers couldn't even imagine. The quiet woman, in unremarkable clothes, was about to demonstrate why some people were legends in circles that most Americans would never know existed. The transformation from invisible observer to decisive actor was beginning, and Sarah Chen was running out of time to remain the person she'd tried to become instead of the weapon she'd once been trained to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The helicopters materialized from heat shimmer into deadly reality as Sarah reached the maintenance hangar that provided both cover and an elevated view of the airfield. What she saw through the chain-link fencing made her blood run cold. These weren't military aircraft responding to assist with a security drill. The approaching helicopters bore no identifying markings, flew in attack formation, and were heading directly toward the flight line where Amy's F-22 and 11 other aircraft sat vulnerable on the tarmac. Sarah's combat-trained mind immediately began calculating trajectories, defensive positions, and potential responses, while her civilian identity screamed at her to find safety with the other families. But safety was an illusion when hostile aircraft were approaching an active military installation, and her sister was still in the cockpit of a fighter jet that had become a high-value target. The base alarm system finally activated, sending warning sirens wailing across Nellis as personnel scrambled to respond to a threat that was developing faster than anyone had anticipated. Sarah watched Colonel Webb coordinating defensive measures through his radio while Major Hayes directed ground crews toward hardened shelters. But their responses felt inadequate against what appeared to be a coordinated assault on one of America's most secure air installations. Through her wire-rimmed glasses, Sarah studied the approaching aircraft with the analytical precision that had once made her invaluable to special operations commanders. The helicopters were modified military surplus, probably stolen or purchased through black market channels, equipped with external weapon pods that suggested serious firepower. Their approach pattern indicated professional training and detailed knowledge of base layout and defensive capabilities. The lead helicopter peeled off from formation and began a strafing run along the flight line, its guns targeting the parked F-22's with precision that confirmed Sarah's assessment about the attacker's sophistication. Explosions erupted along the tarmac as million-dollar aircraft became twisted metal and burning fuel, but Sarah noticed that the attackers were being selective about their targets. They weren't trying to destroy everything. They were trying to capture something specific. Amy's aircraft was among a group of F-22's that the attackers were actively avoiding, herding toward a section of the airfield that would allow for extraction rather than destruction. Sarah realized with growing horror that this wasn't a terrorist attack designed to cause maximum damage. It was a precision operation aimed at stealing America's most advanced fighter technology, along with the pilots qualified to operate it. Ground security forces were responding with admirable speed, but their weapons were designed for perimeter defense against conventional threats, not aerial assault by military-grade aircraft. The base's fixed defensive positions provided excellent protection against ground infiltration, but limited capability against airborne attackers who had obviously studied Nellis vulnerabilities extensively. Sarah watched Amy's F-22 taxiing rapidly toward what appeared to be safety, but was actually movement toward a predetermined capture zone. Her sister's aircraft was being shepherded by the attackers rather than randomly targeted, which meant Amy and the other evaluation pilots had become valuable assets in whatever operation was unfolding. The realization struck Sarah like a physical blow. This entire scenario had been planned around the evaluation flights. Someone with detailed knowledge of the base's operations and pilot schedules had orchestrated an attack designed to capture not just advanced aircraft, but the newest generation of American fighter pilots. Amy and her fellow aviators weren't collateral damage. They were the primary objective. Major Hayes was shouting orders into his radio, trying to coordinate a response that would protect both personnel and classified technology, but the attackers had obviously anticipated standard defensive protocols. They moved with the kind of precision that suggested inside knowledge of how Nellis would respond to different threat scenarios. Sarah found herself automatically cataloging defensive positions and calculating fields of fire from her current location. The maintenance hangar provided excellent concealment and elevation, with clear sight lines across most of the airfield. More importantly, it was positioned at a distance that would allow for precision shooting without putting her in immediate danger from the attacker's weapons. But precision shooting required equipment she didn't possess. Sarah carried no weapons, had no official authority to intervene, and possessed no legal standing to engage in combat operations on American soil. She was a civilian veterinary worker whose military service had ended 3 years earlier when she'd requested discharge rather than accept another deployment that would have required her to kill more people in service of objectives she'd grown to question. The internal conflict between her desire to help and her commitment to civilian life created a paralysis that felt foreign to someone trained to make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. Sarah had spent 3 years suppressing the instincts and capabilities that had once defined her identity, learning to live as someone who healed animals rather than eliminated human threats. One of the attacking helicopters landed near Amy's F-22, disgorging armed personnel who moved with military precision toward the aircraft. Sarah could see her sister still in the cockpit, probably following orders to remain in the aircraft, while base security established control of the situation. But control was an illusion when the people giving orders didn't understand the true nature of the threat they were facing. The armed personnel approaching Amy's aircraft wore tactical gear that suggested professional military training, but their faces were concealed behind masks that prevented identification. They moved with the kind of coordination that indicated extensive rehearsal and detailed planning, confirming Sarah's assessment that this operation had been in development for months or possibly years. Colonel Webb's voice carried across the base communications system as he attempted to establish contact with the attackers. "Unknown aircraft, you are in violation of restricted airspace over a United States military installation. Identify yourselves immediately and withdraw from the area or face military response." The response came in the form of additional explosions along the perimeter, as the attackers demonstrated both their firepower and their contempt for standard military protocols. These weren't people who could be negotiated with or intimidated by threats of retaliation. They had come to Nellis with specific objectives and the capability to achieve them regardless of official opposition. Sarah watched her sister's aircraft being surrounded by hostile personnel and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Amy was trapped in a situation that standard Air Force training hadn't prepared her for, facing people whose intentions were unknown but whose methods suggested they wouldn't hesitate to use violence to achieve their objectives. The other families in the observation area had been evacuated to secure locations, but Sarah remained hidden in her position near the maintenance hangar, torn between self-preservation and the growing certainty that she might be the only person present with the skills necessary to influence the outcome of this crisis. Through the fence, she could see base security forces taking defensive positions, but their deployment suggested they were preparing to repel a conventional ground assault rather than respond to the aerial kidnapping operation that was actually taking place. The disconnect between perceived threat and actual threat would prove fatal if someone didn't intervene with accurate assessment and appropriate response. Sarah's trained eye identified several critical vulnerabilities in the attacker's deployment. Their helicopters were positioned for rapid extraction, but at locations that would be exposed to precision fire from elevated positions. Their ground personnel were focused on aircraft capture rather than perimeter security, creating opportunities for flanking maneuvers that could disrupt their entire operation. But exploiting those vulnerabilities would require capabilities and equipment that Sarah no longer possessed officially. She was a civilian with no legal authority to engage in combat operations, no access to military weapons, and no official support for any action she might take. Intervening would mean abandoning the civilian identity she'd worked 3 years to establish and accepting consequences that could include court-martial, imprisonment, or death. The sound of additional aircraft approaching from the east caught Sarah's attention. These were clearly American military helicopters responding to the base alert, but they were still minutes away from arriving in sufficient force to change the tactical situation. Minutes that the attackers were using efficiently to complete their primary objectives and prepare for extraction. Amy's F-22 was now completely surrounded by hostile personnel, and Sarah could see her sister being forced from the cockpit at gunpoint. The sight of Amy with her hands raised, surrounded by masked gunmen on American soil, shattered whatever remained of Sarah's commitment to civilian non-involvement. The transformation began subtly, with changes in posture and breathing that reflected a shift from observer to operator. Sarah's analytical mind began processing tactical information with the kind of systematic precision that had once made her legendary among people whose names would never appear in public records. Distance to primary targets, approximately 800 meters. Wind conditions, minimal with slight thermal updrafts from heated tarmac. Available positions, multiple elevated locations with clear fields of fire. Available weapons, none immediately accessible, but military installations contained equipment that could be requisitioned under emergency circumstances. Sarah moved from her concealment with the kind of purposeful stealth that indicated a fundamental change in her role and intentions. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the veterinary worker who had come to watch her sister's flight evaluation. She was becoming someone much more dangerous, someone whose existence was supposed to remain classified indefinitely. The base armory was 200 meters from her current position, protected by security measures that would challenge most intruders, but were designed to keep unauthorized personnel out rather than authorized personnel in. Sarah's military identification had been deactivated upon her discharge, but the biometric systems might still retain her records, and emergency protocols sometimes overrode standard access restrictions. As she moved toward the armory, Sarah passed groups of base personnel who were focused entirely on the dramatic events unfolding on the flight line. Her unremarkable appearance and civilian clothes made her invisible to people whose attention was captured by explosions, gunfire, and the unprecedented sight of foreign military forces operating on American soil. The armory's security systems presented exactly the challenge Sarah had anticipated. Her palm print and retinal scan were no longer in the active database, but emergency override protocols remained accessible to personnel with the right knowledge and sufficient motivation. Sarah's fingers moved across the keypad with the confidence of someone who had accessed similar systems under pressure many times before. The heavy door swung open to reveal an inventory that would have impressed most firearms enthusiasts, but was merely adequate for Sarah's specific requirements. She needed range, precision, and stopping power at distances that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Most importantly, she needed equipment that would allow her to engage targets without exposing herself to retaliation from the attacker's superior firepower. Sarah selected a Barrett M82 sniper rifle, the same weapon system she'd used during her most significant military operations. The familiar weight and balance felt natural in her hands despite 3 years of civilian life, and her muscle memory automatically began the preparation routine that had once been as natural as breathing. Ammunition selection required careful consideration of targets and tactical requirements. The attackers were wearing body armor that would defeat standard rifle rounds, but their aircraft represented vulnerabilities that could be exploited with proper placement and sufficient penetrating power. Sarah loaded the Barrett with armor-piercing rounds and prepared for shooting scenarios that would test every skill she'd ever developed. The movement back toward a suitable firing position required all of Sarah's stealth training and knowledge of base layout. She needed elevation, concealment, and clear fields of fire without alerting either the attackers or base security to her unauthorized presence with military equipment. Her civilian status made her actions technically illegal, regardless of the circumstances that motivated them. Sarah established her shooting position on the roof of a communications building that provided excellent sightlines across the airfield while offering concealment from ground observation. The Barrett's bipod deployed smoothly on the concrete surface, and Sarah began the familiar ritual of range estimation, wind assessment, and target prioritization that had once been the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Through the rifle's scope, Amy's situation became clear with terrifying precision. Her sister was being forced toward one of the attacking helicopters along with 3 other evaluation pilots, all of them clearly intended for extraction rather than execution. The attackers needed living pilots who could operate the stolen F-22's, which meant Amy's value as a hostage would protect her only as long as she remained useful to their objectives. Sarah's crosshairs settled on the lead helicopter's pilot, a clear shot that would eliminate the attackers' primary extraction capability and force them into tactical decisions they hadn't planned for. But killing the pilot would also escalate the situation beyond negotiation and potentially trigger retaliation against the hostages, including Amy. The scope shifted to other potential targets, evaluating options that might disrupt the operation without immediately endangering the captured pilots. The attacker's ground commander was directing personnel with obvious authority, but he remained partially concealed behind aircraft that limited Sarah's shooting angle. Other targets presented themselves and disappeared as the tactical situation continued evolving. Sarah's breathing slowed into the rhythm that preceded precision shooting, her heartbeat steadying as training and instinct merged into the focused state that had made her legendary among people who understood the requirements of impossible shots under pressure. The Barrett felt like an extension of her will, aimed at targets that represented clear and immediate threats to American personnel and national security. But even as she prepared to engage, Sarah understood that firing the first shot would end her civilian life permanently. There would be no returning to anonymity after demonstrating capabilities that were supposed to remain classified forever. She would become a person of interest to intelligence agencies, military commands, and congressional oversight committees that would want detailed explanations for actions taken without authorization or legal justification. The sound of additional explosions from the flight line indicated that the attackers were expanding their operations beyond aircraft theft toward general destruction of base capabilities. Whatever window existed for negotiated resolution was closing rapidly as the situation escalated toward the kind of comprehensive assault that would require massive military response and potential civilian casualties. Through her scope, Sarah watched Amy being forced into the helicopter that would carry her away from American soil and into circumstances that no training could have prepared her for. Her sister's face showed the kind of controlled fear that indicated military discipline under extreme pressure, but also the growing realization that official rescue might not arrive in time to prevent her capture. Sarah's finger found the Barrett's trigger with the kind of familiar precision that felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the civilian veterinary worker. She was Ghostwire, and American lives were in immediate danger from people who had made the mistake of operating within range of her capabilities. The first shot would announce her presence to everyone within miles and transform a complex hostage situation into something entirely different. But it would also demonstrate that the attackers had seriously miscalculated both the defenses available at Nellis Air Force Base and the capabilities of the people they'd chosen to threaten. Sarah's breathing steadied into the final rhythm that preceded irreversible action. Through her scope, targets presented themselves with the kind of clarity that indicated perfect conditions for precision shooting. The morning sun had climbed high enough to eliminate shadows without creating glare, wind conditions remained minimal, and her position provided concealment that would allow for multiple shots before requiring relocation. The transformation from invisible observer to active operator was complete. Sarah Chen had arrived at Nellis Air Force Base as a supportive sister, hoping to witness Amy's achievement in flight training. But she was about to reveal herself as something far more dangerous to people who had seriously underestimated the price of threatening American military personnel on United States soil. The Barrett's scope tracked smoothly across targets that would soon discover why some people became legends in circles that preferred to keep their existence classified indefinitely. Sarah had spent 3 years learning to live as someone ordinary, But extraordinary circumstances were about to force her to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible when American lives hung in the balance. The Barrett M82's trigger broke cleanly under Sarah's finger at exactly 0947 hours, sending a 50 caliber armor-piercing round across 847 meters of Nevada desert air toward the lead helicopter's tail rotor assembly. The shot was perfect, threading between structural supports to sever hydraulic lines and control cables with surgical precision. The aircraft's tail rotor disintegrated in a shower of metal fragments, sending the helicopter into an uncontrolled spin that forced an immediate emergency landing. Sarah was already acquiring her second target before the first helicopter hit the ground. Through her scope, she could see the attacker's ground commander shouting orders into his radio, trying to coordinate a response to the unexpected sniper fire that had just eliminated their primary extraction capability. His position behind Amy's F-22 provided partial concealment, but not enough to protect him from someone who had learned to make impossible shots under conditions that would challenge the world's best marksmen. The second shot punched through the aircraft's landing gear assembly and into the commander's center mass, dropping him instantly and sending his radio spinning across the tarmac. The psychological impact on his subordinates was immediate and devastating. Disciplined military operators suddenly found themselves facing an invisible enemy with capabilities that exceeded anything in their tactical planning. Sarah shifted her aim toward the helicopter that held Amy and the other captured pilots, but the aircraft was already lifting off in response to the sniper fire. The pilot was good, using the F-22's as cover while gaining altitude and distance from the unknown shooter. But his evasive maneuvers put the helicopter into a flight path that would take it directly over Sarah's position at maximum effective range for the Barrett. The mathematics of the shot were staggering. The helicopter was moving at approximately 60 knots at an altitude of 300 feet, following a trajectory that would provide only seconds of opportunity for engagement. Sarah would need to calculate lead time, elevation adjustment, and wind drift, while accounting for the aircraft's evasive maneuvers and her own shooting angle from an elevated position. But the most challenging aspect of the shot wasn't the technical requirements. Sarah needed to disable the helicopter without killing the pilot or passengers, forcing an emergency landing that would allow rescue of the hostages while neutralizing the aircraft's offensive capabilities. A miss would alert the pilot to her position and capabilities, while an over-penetrating hit could cause catastrophic damage that would kill everyone aboard. Sarah's scope tracked the helicopter's movement as her mind processed calculations that would have challenged a computer targeting system. Lead time: 4.3 seconds at current speed and trajectory. Elevation: -12 degrees from her shooting position to intercept point. Wind: minimal crosswind with slight thermal updraft from heated concrete below. Target selection required split-second analysis of the helicopter's vulnerable systems and their accessibility from her shooting angle. The main rotor assembly was too heavily armored and mechanically complex to disable with a single shot. The engine compartment offered better penetration possibilities but risked catastrophic explosion that would kill the hostages. Sarah settled on the tailboom structure, specifically the junction where control cables and hydraulic lines converged near the tail rotor gearbox. A precision shot at that location would sever flight controls without immediately destroying the aircraft, forcing the pilot into auto-rotation landing that would preserve the lives of everyone aboard while eliminating the helicopter as a threat. The Barrett's crosshairs settled on a target area roughly 6 inches square, moving at 60 knots 300 feet above the ground, requiring a shot that would intersect the aircraft's flight path at exactly the right moment to achieve the intended effect. Sarah's breathing slowed into the final rhythm that preceded shots that separated legends from merely excellent marksmen. The trigger broke at the perfect moment, sending the 50 caliber round on a trajectory that would either save 4 American pilots or kill them all depending on Sarah's calculations and execution. Time stretched as the bullet traveled across 1,247 meters of open air toward a target that was moving through three-dimensional space at speeds that challenged human perception. The impact was everything Sarah had hoped for and more. The armor-piercing round struck the tail boom precisely where she'd aimed, severing control cables and hydraulic lines while leaving the main structure intact. The helicopter immediately entered auto-rotation as the pilot fought to maintain control of an aircraft that no longer responded to his commands. Sarah watched through her scope as the pilot demonstrated exceptional skill in managing an emergency landing with a critically damaged aircraft. The helicopter touched down hard but intact in an open area of the airfield, close enough to base security forces to ensure rapid rescue of the hostages, but far enough from the attacker's remaining personnel to prevent immediate retaliation. Base security forces responded instantly to the downed helicopter, surrounding it with overwhelming firepower, while medics moved to assist the occupants. Sarah could see Amy being helped from the aircraft, apparently uninjured but clearly shaken by an experience that had pushed her far beyond anything covered in flight training. But the engagement was far from over. The remaining attackers had regrouped around their second helicopter and were preparing for either extraction or retaliation against the base personnel who had disrupted their operation. Their body language suggested professional military training and the kind of tactical discipline that wouldn't be easily broken by the loss of their primary aircraft and ground commander. Sarah's position had been compromised by muzzle flash and sound signature from her previous shots. The attackers would be scanning for her location using both visual observation and whatever technical surveillance capabilities they possessed. Remaining in her current position would mean exposure to return fire from weapons that could easily penetrate the concrete structure she was using for concealment. The movement to a new shooting position required all of Sarah's stealth training and tactical knowledge. She needed to relocate without being observed while maintaining the capability to engage remaining threats that still posed significant danger to base personnel and captured technology. The Barrett's weight made rapid movement challenging, but its range and stopping power remained essential for engaging targets at distances beyond the effective range of the attacker's weapons. Sarah established her new position on the roof of the base communications center, 400 meters from her previous location and offering different angles of approach to the remaining threats. The movement had taken precious time that the attackers used to organize their remaining personnel and prepare for whatever action they intended to take next. Through her new scope position, Sarah could see that the situation had evolved beyond simple aircraft theft towards something approaching a conventional military assault on Nellis Air Force Base. The attackers had brought more personnel and equipment than initially observed, including heavy weapons that pose serious threats to base security forces and infrastructure. The remaining helicopter was being used as a mobile command platform, while ground personnel established defensive positions around high-value targets. Their deployment suggested professional military planning and detailed knowledge of base layout and defensive capabilities. These weren't opportunistic criminals or ideologically motivated terrorists. They were experienced operators conducting a mission that had been planned extensively and rehearsed thoroughly. Colonel Webb's voice carried across the base communication system as he attempted to coordinate a comprehensive response to threats that had exceeded all planning scenarios. All personnel, we are facing a coordinated assault by unknown military forces. Implement maximum security protocols and prepare for extended engagement until reinforcements arrive. The reinforcements Colonel Webb referenced were still minutes away from effective intervention, but the attackers were using that time efficiently to complete objectives that went beyond simple aircraft theft. Sarah could see them placing demolition charges on critical infrastructure, while maintaining defensive positions that would challenge conventional assault tactics. Major Hayes had taken command of the immediate tactical response, deploying base security forces in positions that provided good coverage of the primary threat areas. But his personnel were trained and equipped for perimeter security rather than the kind of combined arms engagement that was developing across the airfield. Sarah's scope tracked across multiple targets that presented varying levels of threat and opportunity for engagement. The attackers' heavy weapons positions offered clear shots, but were also the most likely to return accurate fire toward her location. Individual personnel provided easier targets but less tactical impact on the overall threat situation. The decision came down to target prioritization based on immediate threat to American personnel and long-term mission impact. Sarah identified the attackers' demolition team as the highest priority target, since their success would cause infrastructure damage that could affect base operations for months or years beyond the immediate crisis. The demolition team was working near the base fuel storage facility, placing charges that could create catastrophic secondary explosions if detonated successfully. Their position offered limited concealment but required precision shooting through industrial structures that could deflect or fragment incoming rounds. Sarah's first shot at the new position targeted the demolition team leader, a clean hit that eliminated the most experienced member of the group and sent the others scrambling for cover. Her second and third shots dispatched the remaining demolition specialists before they could complete their work, preventing potential destruction that could have crippled Nellis for years. But engaging the demolition team had revealed Sarah's new position to the attackers' heavy weapons crews, who immediately began directing suppressing fire toward the communications building. 50 caliber machine gun rounds and rocket-propelled grenades began impacting around Sarah's position with accuracy that confirmed the attackers' professional training and equipment quality. The concrete structure provided adequate protection against small arms fire, but wouldn't withstand sustained assault from heavy weapons. Sarah needed to eliminate the weapons crews quickly or relocate again to avoid being overwhelmed by superior firepower directed against a stationary target. The heavy weapons positions were well protected and professionally sighted, requiring shots that would challenge even Sarah's exceptional capabilities. The machine gun crew was operating from behind reinforced positions with overlapping fields of fire, while the rocket team remained mobile and used the base infrastructure for concealment between engagements. Sarah's scope settled on the machine gun position first, identifying a narrow gap between armor plates that would allow access to the gunner's position. The shot required perfect timing to catch the gunner during the brief moment when he was exposed while engaging targets, but success would eliminate the most immediate threat to her position. The Barrett cracked again, sending another 50 caliber round across 800 meters of contested airspace toward a target that was actively trying to kill her. The bullet found the gap in the armor exactly as Sarah had calculated, eliminating the machine gunner and forcing his assistant to abandon the position. But the rocket team had used the machine gun engagement to maneuver closer to Sarah's position, and their next round impacted the communications building with enough force to shake the entire structure. Concrete fragments and debris rained down around Sarah's position as she realized that remaining stationary would mean death within minutes. The movement to yet another shooting position would expose Sarah to observation and direct fire from the remaining attackers, but staying in place guaranteed destruction from weapons that were systematically demolishing her concealment. The choice between certain death and probable death wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah slung the Barrett across her back and began the most dangerous movement of her military career, crossing open ground under fire while carrying equipment that made stealth impossible and speed essential. The distance to her next position was only 200 meters, but it might as well have been 2,000 given the firepower being directed toward her general area. The sprint across the open courtyard required every bit of speed and tactical movement Sarah had ever learned, while incoming fire made her route resemble a video game more than professional military engagement. Bullets sparked off concrete around her feet as she reached the relative safety of the maintenance complex that would provide her next shooting position. But relative safety was still extremely dangerous when facing opponents with heavy weapons and professional training. Sarah could hear them coordinating their response to her movements, directing fire toward her new location while maneuvering to positions that would allow direct assault on her position. The maintenance complex offered excellent concealment and multiple escape routes, but its distance from the remaining threats meant longer shots under increasingly difficult conditions. Sarah established her position on the building's highest accessible point, gaining elevation that would improve her shooting angles while making her more visible to enemy observation. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the tactical situation had shifted again. Base security forces were engaging the attackers with increasing effectiveness as reinforcements arrived and command coordination improved. But the attackers were fighting with the kind of desperate professionalism that suggested they understood extraction was no longer possible and were focused on causing maximum damage before inevitable defeat. The remaining helicopter was being used to evacuate the attackers' leadership while covering personnel completed whatever demolition work remained possible. Sarah realized that she was witnessing the final phase of an operation that had probably been planned as a quick extraction, but had evolved into a fighting withdrawal under circumstances the attackers hadn't anticipated. The helicopter presented Sarah's most challenging target yet. It was maintaining tactical movement while evacuating personnel, using the base infrastructure for concealment, while staying within range of her position for only brief intervals. More importantly, destroying the aircraft would eliminate the attackers' remaining escape route and force them into a final desperate stand that could cost additional American lives. But allowing the helicopter to escape would mean that the operations leadership would survive to plan future attacks against American military installations. The people aboard that aircraft possessed detailed knowledge of Nellis Air Force Base operations, security procedures, and defensive capabilities that could prove invaluable to hostile forces planning similar operations. Sarah's decision came down to immediate tactical considerations versus long-term strategic implications. Destroying the helicopter would save American lives today but might cost more lives in future operations, planned by people who possessed intimate knowledge of American defensive vulnerabilities. The Barrett's scope tracked the helicopter through its evasive maneuvers as Sarah calculated the most complex shot of her career. The aircraft was moving unpredictably at varying altitudes and speeds, using structures for concealment, while maintaining enough visibility to coordinate the evacuation of remaining ground personnel. The target Sarah selected was the helicopter's main rotor hub, a shot that would cause immediate loss of lift without necessarily killing the occupants. If successful, the aircraft would be forced down within the base perimeter, where its occupants could be captured and interrogated. If unsuccessful, the attacker's leadership would escape with information that could endanger American forces for years to come. The mathematics were staggering. Moving target at variable speed and altitude, multiple potential impact points depending on timing, wind conditions that had changed throughout the morning engagement, and her own position that was partially concealed behind structural elements that could interfere with bullet trajectory. Sarah's breathing slowed into the rhythm that had made her legendary among people who understood the requirements of impossible shots under perfect conditions, let alone shots that challenged the theoretical limits of what was achievable with conventional weapons and human capabilities. The trigger broke cleanly as the helicopter passed through the precise point in space and time that Sarah's calculations had identified as the optimal intercept location. The .50 caliber round traveled 1,847 meters through air that shimmered with heat and smoke from burning aircraft and infrastructure, guided by mathematics and instinct toward a target that was moving through three-dimensional space at speeds that made visual tracking nearly impossible. The impact was perfect. The armor-piercing round struck the main rotor hub with surgical precision, severing critical components while leaving enough structure intact to prevent immediate catastrophic failure. The helicopter entered auto-rotation immediately, the pilot fighting to control an aircraft that was losing altitude and forward momentum with each passing second. Sarah watched through her scope as the pilot demonstrated exceptional skill in managing another emergency landing with a critically damaged aircraft. The helicopter touched down hard within the base perimeter, close enough to security forces to ensure immediate capture of its occupants, while far enough from remaining threats to prevent rescue attempts. Base security forces surrounded the downed helicopter within seconds, overwhelming its occupants with firepower that made resistance impossible. Sarah could see figures in tactical gear surrendering under circumstances that guaranteed they would be available for interrogation about their knowledge of base operations and future threat planning. The engagement was effectively over. The remaining ground-based attackers found themselves isolated without air support or command coordination, facing reinforced base security forces that had adapted to the threat and established tactical superiority. Their surrender was inevitable given the hopelessness of their tactical situation. Colonel Webb's voice carried across the base communication system with obvious relief and professional satisfaction. All personnel, the immediate threat has been neutralized. Continue security protocols until complete site clearance is achieved. Outstanding work by all personnel involved in the response. But Sarah knew that her involvement in neutralizing the threat would require explanations that she wasn't prepared to provide. Her unauthorized access to military weapons, engagement of hostile forces without official sanction, and demonstration of capabilities that were supposed to remain classified created legal and security complications that would follow her for years. The movement away from her shooting position required careful planning to avoid observation by base security forces, who would soon be conducting comprehensive site surveys and evidence collection. Sarah needed to distance herself from the Barrett and return to her civilian identity before investigators began analyzing the engagement and identifying personnel responsible for the precision shooting that had saved American lives. But returning the Barrett to the armory without detection presented almost as many challenges as the combat engagement itself. The weapon bore evidence of recent firing that would be obvious to any competent investigator, and its absence from inventory would eventually be noticed during routine inspections. Sarah solved the problem by leaving the Barrett in a location where it would be discovered by security forces and assumed to have been used by base personnel during the engagement. The positioning required careful consideration of sight lines and tactical logic, but created a plausible explanation for the weapon's presence and use during the crisis. The return to civilian appearance required more than simply removing military equipment. Sarah needed to eliminate any evidence of her involvement in combat operations while positioning herself to provide a credible explanation for her presence during the engagement. Her civilian clothes had collected dust and debris that would be consistent with seeking shelter during the attack, but inconsistent with active participation in combat operations. Sarah made her way back toward the evacuation area where civilian families had been moved for safety during the engagement. Her arrival needed to appear consistent with someone who had been sheltering in place, rather than actively engaging hostile forces with precision rifle fire. The other families were gathered in a secure briefing room, discussing the morning's events with a mixture of relief and confusion that reflected their limited understanding of what had actually taken place. Sarah joined the group quietly, her unremarkable appearance and civilian clothes allowing her to blend seamlessly with people who had experienced the attack as victims rather than participants. Amy found her within minutes, embracing her sister with tears of relief and gratitude that nearly broke Sarah's carefully maintained composure. Her sister was safe, the base was secure, and the immediate threat had been neutralized. But the questions about how and why the threat had been defeated so effectively would eventually lead to investigations that could expose Sarah's involvement. "I was so scared," Amy whispered against Sarah's shoulder. "They had guns pointed at us, and I thought we were going to be taken somewhere terrible. Then suddenly there was gunfire from somewhere, and their helicopter started spinning out of control." Sarah held her sister close, feeling the weight of secrets that couldn't be shared and decisions that couldn't be explained. "The important thing is that you're safe now." Base security did their job and protected everyone. Major Hayes approached the civilian group with updates on the situation and arrangements for departure from the base. His expression reflected professional satisfaction with the outcome, but also confusion about aspects of the engagement that didn't match conventional tactical doctrine. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that all hostile forces have been captured or neutralized, and the base is secure. We'll be arranging transportation back to civilian areas shortly, and we appreciate your patience during what I know was a frightening experience." One of the other family members raised her hand with obvious concern. "Major, how did our security forces respond so effectively to such a sophisticated attack? Those helicopters looked like military equipment, and the news is saying this was a coordinated assault by professional operators." Major Hayes hesitated before responding, clearly struggling with information that he couldn't fully explain. "Our response benefited from several factors that came together at exactly the right time. We had exceptional marksmanship from personnel whose identity must remain classified for security reasons, combined with tactical coordination that exceeded our own expectations." Sarah remained silent during the briefing, but she could see the questions in Major Hayes' expression when he looked toward the civilian group. Someone had demonstrated shooting capabilities that exceeded anything in his experience, and the official explanation would eventually require identifying the personnel responsible for shots that had saved American lives under impossible conditions. The transportation arrangements provided Sarah with the opportunity to separate from the group and return to her civilian life, but she understood that investigators would eventually trace the engagement back to personnel with the training and capability to make shots that challenged the theoretical limits of marksmanship under combat conditions. As she walked toward her Honda Civic in the visitor parking area, Sarah reflected on the morning that had started with watching Amy's flight evaluation and ended with combat engagement against hostile forces on American soil. Her civilian life had been shattered by circumstances that forced her to reveal capabilities she'd hoped never to use again. But Amy was safe, and that mattered more than the complications that would follow. Sarah had learned to live as someone ordinary, but extraordinary circumstances had forced her to demonstrate that some capabilities couldn't be suppressed indefinitely when American lives were at stake. The drive back to Bakersfield would provide time to process what had happened and prepare for questions that would eventually come from people who needed to understand how the attack on Nellis Air Force Base had been defeated by marksmanship that exceeded official capabilities. Sarah started her car and drove away from Nellis Air Force Base, leaving behind evidence and questions that would follow her for years, while taking with her the satisfaction of knowing that her sister and fellow Americans were safe because she'd been willing to abandon her carefully constructed civilian identity when it mattered most. 3 weeks later, Sarah was working the night shift at the veterinary clinic when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar when she answered. "Miss Chen, this is General Patricia Hayes from United States Special Operations Command. I believe we need to have a conversation about recent events in Nevada." Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that her quiet civilian life was about to end permanently. "Yes, ma'am. I've been expecting your call. I'll be in Bakersfield tomorrow morning." There are some opportunities we'd like to discuss with you, assuming you're interested in putting your capabilities to use in service of your country once again. Sarah looked around the veterinary clinic where she'd spent 3 years learning to heal rather than harm, surrounded by animals who needed care, rather than enemies who needed elimination. But she also thought about Amy's tears of relief and gratitude, and the other American families who had been spared tragedy because someone had been willing to make impossible shots under perfect conditions. "I'll be here, General. We should definitely talk." As she hung up the phone, Sarah understood that her transformation from invisible civilian to active operator was complete and permanent. The quiet woman who had driven to Nevada to watch her sister's flight evaluation would never exist again, replaced by someone whose capabilities were too valuable to remain hidden when American lives were at stake. The veterinary clinic would need a new night shift worker, but America's enemies would soon discover that the most dangerous threats often came from directions they never thought to watch. Sarah Chen had learned to live as someone ordinary, but she was about to resume being someone extraordinary in service of objectives that mattered more than personal anonymity. The morning sun would soon rise over Bakersfield, bringing with it conversations that would reshape Sarah's life and responsibilities that she'd hoped never to accept again. But Amy was safe, America was protected, and sometimes that was worth sacrificing everything else to achieve. The secure conference room at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs felt more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting facility, despite the polished mahogany table and official portraits lining the walls. Sarah Chen sat across from General Patricia Hayes, acutely aware that this conversation would determine whether she spent the next decade in federal prison or returned to the shadowy world of classified operations that she'd tried so desperately to escape. General Hayes was exactly what Sarah had expected from their brief phone conversation, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair pulled into a regulation bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her uniform bore the kind of ribbon rack that indicated extensive combat experience in command positions that few officers ever achieved. But more importantly, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from making life-and-death decisions under pressure that would break most people. "Before we begin," General Hayes said, opening a folder that was thicker than Sarah had anticipated, "I want to make something clear. You're not in trouble. What happened at Nellis Air Force Base 3 weeks ago saved American lives and prevented the theft of classified technology that could have compromised national security for decades. However, your methods created complications that require careful management." Sarah remained silent, having learned during her previous military service that senior officers preferred to control conversations until they decided subordinate input was appropriate. But she couldn't help noticing that the folder contained surveillance photographs, ballistics reports, and what appeared to be detailed analysis of every shot she'd fired during the engagement. The official report credits base security forces with neutralizing the attack through coordinated defensive actions and exceptional marksmanship by unidentified personnel, General Hayes continued. That report is accurate as far as it goes, but incomplete regarding the specific capabilities demonstrated during the engagement. The general pulled out a series of photographs showing the damage Sarah's shots had inflicted on the attacking helicopters. The precision was obvious even to casual observers. Clean hits that had disabled aircraft without killing occupants. Surgical strikes that had eliminated specific threats while minimizing collateral damage. "These shots," General Hayes said, pointing to the images, "represent a level of precision that exceeds the documented capabilities of any personnel officially present at Nellis during the attack. The distances, target movement, environmental conditions, and accuracy achieved suggest training and experience that goes far beyond standard military marksmanship programs." Sarah finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "General, I assume you've reviewed my service record and understand my background in precision shooting. The shots at Nellis were challenging, but within the theoretical capabilities of properly trained personnel with appropriate equipment." General Hayes smiled slightly, the expression suggesting she'd expected exactly that response. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? Your service record shows exceptional performance in marksmanship training, but it doesn't reflect the full extent of your capabilities or deployment history. The classified addendum to your file tells a very different story." The general opened another section of the folder, revealing documents that Sarah recognized as mission reports from operations she'd hoped would remain buried forever. Her throat tightened as she saw photographs from Syria, Afghanistan, and other locations where she'd been deployed under cover identities that supposedly didn't exist in official records. Operation Desert Thunder, March 2019. Elimination of high-value target at 1,847 meters under adverse weather conditions. Operation Silent Storm, September 2020. Multiple target engagement that prevented terrorist attack on American embassy personnel. Operation Ghost Protocol, January 2021. Precision shooting that enabled extraction of captured Delta Force operators. Each mission, General Hayes described, represented weeks or months of Sarah's life that she'd tried to forget. Successful operations that had saved American lives, while adding to the psychological burden that had eventually driven her to request discharge from military service. Your official discharge papers cite family obligations and desire to pursue civilian career opportunities, General Hayes observed. The real reason was psychological evaluation recommendations following your final deployment, specifically concerns about operational sustainability and long-term mental health impacts of extended deployment in high-stress assignments. Sarah felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. Her decision to leave the military hadn't been about family obligations or career opportunities. It had been about reaching the psychological breaking point where continued killing, even in service of legitimate objectives, threatened to destroy whatever remained of her humanity. General, I've built a civilian life that allows me to contribute positively to society without causing harm to other people. My work at the veterinary clinic involves healing rather than harming, and I've found peace in that transition. What happened at Nellis was an emergency response to protect my sister and other American personnel, not an indication that I want to return to active operations. General Hayes nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting she understood more about Sarah's psychological state than the official records indicated. I appreciate your perspective, and I respect the choice you made to prioritize your mental health over continued military service. But circumstances have developed that require capabilities you possess, and very few other people can provide. The general pulled out satellite imagery that showed military installations in various countries, with annotations that suggested ongoing intelligence collection and threat assessment. Sarah recognized several locations from her previous deployments, places where American forces faced sophisticated enemies with advanced equipment and professional training. The attack on Nellis wasn't an isolated incident, General Hayes explained. We've identified similar operations being planned against military installations worldwide, all involving theft of advanced aircraft and capture of qualified pilots. The sophistication and coordination suggest state-level sponsorship with access to detailed intelligence about American defensive capabilities. Sarah studied the imagery, her trained eye automatically identifying potential shooting positions, defensive vulnerabilities, and tactical approaches that enemies might use against American installations. Despite her desire to remain civilian, she couldn't ignore the professional assessment that these facilities faced threats their standard security measures weren't designed to counter. We need someone who can provide precision shooting capabilities at extended ranges under adverse conditions, someone with experience in counterterrorism operations and the psychological stability to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. Your performance at Nellis demonstrated exactly those capabilities under circumstances that most people would find overwhelming. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge that Sarah had been dreading since the phone call 3 weeks earlier. General Hayes was asking her to return to the world of classified operations and sanctioned killing that had nearly destroyed her psychological stability before her discharge. General, I understand the importance of protecting American installations and personnel, but I left military service for reasons that haven't changed. I'm not psychologically prepared to resume killing people, even in service of legitimate objectives. The work I do now allows me to help rather than harm, and that distinction matters to my long-term mental health. General Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with the kind of analytical attention that suggested she was evaluating multiple factors beyond the immediate conversation. What if I told you that we've developed new approaches to precision shooting that minimize lethal force while maintaining operational effectiveness? Would that change your perspective on potential involvement? The concept intrigued Sarah despite her reservations about returning to military service. Her biggest psychological challenge during previous deployments had been the requirement to kill people, even when those people represented clear threats to American personnel and objectives. If new technologies or techniques could achieve mission objectives without causing deaths, that might address her primary concern about resumed military involvement. What kind of approaches? Sarah asked, her professional curiosity overcoming her civilian reluctance to engage with military planning. General Hayes smiled, recognizing that she'd identified a potential opening in Sarah's psychological defenses. Advanced, non-lethal ammunition that can disable targets without causing permanent harm. Precision guidance systems that allow for surgical strikes against equipment rather than personnel. And operational planning that prioritizes capture over elimination whenever possible. The technologies General Hayes described represented significant advances over the equipment Sarah had used during her previous military service. If American forces could achieve tactical objectives without killing enemy personnel, that would address many of the psychological challenges that had driven her to seek discharge. Additionally, the general continued, we're proposing a consulting role rather than active deployment. You would provide training for military personnel, assist with operational planning, and serve as backup precision shooting capability for emergencies like what happened at Nellis. Most of your work would be conducted from secure facilities in the United States, rather than overseas deployment. The proposal addressed many of Sarah's concerns about returning to military service, while offering the opportunity to contribute to national security without the psychological burden of extended combat deployments. But she remained suspicious of assurances that her involvement would be limited to non-combat roles. General, I appreciate the consideration you've given to my psychological concerns, but military operations have a way of escalating beyond initial planning parameters. What happens when consulting and training evolve into deployment requirements that exceed the boundaries we're discussing? General Hayes pulled out a legal document that appeared to be some kind of contract or service agreement. We've prepared formal limitations on your service obligations that would prevent involuntary deployment outside the parameters we're establishing. You would retain the right to decline specific assignments that exceed your psychological comfort level or conflict with your personal values. Sarah examined the document, noting clauses that seemed designed to protect her interests while providing the military with access to her capabilities under controlled circumstances. The legal language was complex, but the basic framework appeared to offer genuine protection against the kind of mission creep that had characterized her previous military experience. There's one more factor I should mention, General Hayes said, her tone becoming more serious. The intelligence we've gathered suggests that the people who attacked Nellis have detailed information about American defensive capabilities and personnel. They may specifically target individuals who demonstrated exceptional performance during the engagement. The implication was clear and disturbing. Sarah's involvement in defeating the Nellis attack had potentially made her a target for retaliation by people with sophisticated intelligence capabilities and the resources to conduct operations on American soil. You're saying I'm in danger regardless of whether I accept your offer? Sarah asked, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with realizing she was trapped by circumstances beyond her control. I'm saying that your demonstration of capabilities at Nellis has already compromised your civilian anonymity, General Hayes replied. We can provide protection and resources that would be unavailable to you as a private citizen, or you can face potential threats with only civilian law enforcement support. Sarah understood that she was being presented with a choice between controlled return to military service and uncontrolled exposure to retaliation from sophisticated enemies. The decision felt like choosing between different forms of captivity rather than genuine alternatives. If I agree to this arrangement, what specific obligations would I be accepting? I need to understand exactly what I'm committing to before making a decision that would reshape my entire life. General Hayes opened another section of the folder, revealing detailed job descriptions and organizational charts that showed how Sarah would fit into existing military command structures. The complexity suggested months of planning that had preceded their conversation. Initial assignment would involve establishing a precision shooting training program for special operations personnel, with emphasis on non-lethal techniques and equipment familiarization. You would also serve as a consultant for operational planning involving precision shooting requirements under challenging conditions. The training program description appealed to Sarah's desire to contribute positively while using her capabilities to improve other people's effectiveness rather than directly engaging in combat operations. Teaching skills that could save American lives felt more consistent with her psychological needs than using those skills to take lives. Secondary responsibilities would include emergency response capability for situations similar to what occurred at Nellis, specifically precision shooting support for domestic security threats that exceed standard law enforcement capabilities. Your involvement would be limited to situations where American lives are in immediate danger. Sarah could see the logic in maintaining precision shooting capabilities for domestic emergencies, particularly given the increasing sophistication of threats against American military installations. But she remained concerned about how emergency response could evolve into regular combat assignments. Finally, you would participate in research and development of advanced precision shooting technologies, including non-lethal ammunition systems, guidance technologies, and training methods that could improve overall military effectiveness, while reducing casualties among both American forces and enemy personnel. The research and development component offered the most appealing aspect of the proposed arrangement, combining Sarah's expertise with technological advancement that could benefit military personnel while addressing her concerns about lethal force applications. "What about my sister Amy?" Sarah asked, realizing that accepting military service would affect her relationship with a family member who had inadvertently triggered her return to classified operations. Her career in the Air Force could be complicated by association with classified programs. General Hayes had obviously anticipated this concern, pulling out documents related to Amy's career progression and security clearance status. Lieutenant Amy Chen has been approved for advanced security clearances that would allow her to serve in assignments requiring knowledge of classified programs. Her performance during the Nellis incident, combined with her flight training achievements, has made her an attractive candidate for specialized aviation programs. Sarah realized that her sister's military career might actually benefit from association with classified operations, assuming Amy was interested in the kind of challenging assignments that came with higher security clearances and specialized training. We've also identified potential collaboration opportunities between your precision shooting capabilities and her aviation skills, specifically in developing tactics for air-ground coordination that could improve mission effectiveness while reducing risk to personnel. The possibility of working with Amy in professional capacity appealed to Sarah, offering the opportunity to maintain family relationships while contributing to military objectives that aligned with her values and capabilities. "General, I need time to consider everything we've discussed. This decision would affect every aspect of my life, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before committing to service obligations that could last for years." General Hayes nodded, her expression indicating understanding of the complexities Sarah faced in making such a significant life decision. "Take whatever time you need, but understand that the threats we've identified are developing rapidly. The longer we wait to implement enhanced defensive measures, the greater the risk to American personnel and installations." Sarah stood to leave, her mind already processing the information and options that General Hayes had presented. The choice between continued civilian life and return to military service felt like choosing between different forms of constraint rather than genuine freedom. As she walked toward the door, General Hayes called after her. "Sarah, one more thing. Your work at the veterinary clinic involves healing animals that can't defend themselves against harm. The work we're proposing involves protecting people who can't defend themselves against sophisticated threats. The core mission isn't that different." The comparison struck Sarah as both accurate and manipulative, appealing to her desire to help vulnerable creatures while minimizing the psychological differences between healing and harming. But it also highlighted the reality that her capabilities could serve protective purposes that aligned with her values if applied under appropriate constraints. The drive back to Bakersfield provided hours to process the conversation and evaluate options that felt inadequate regardless of which choice she made. Sarah's civilian life offered peace and anonymity, but potentially exposed her to retaliation from enemies who viewed her as a threat. Military service offered protection and purpose, but required engagement with violence that had previously damaged her psychological stability. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah had reached a preliminary decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would accept General Hayes' offer, but with modifications that addressed her specific concerns about psychological sustainability and operational limitations. The phone call to General Hayes 3 days later confirmed arrangements that would reshape Sarah's life, while providing the flexibility to maintain her essential values and psychological well-being. "General, I'm prepared to accept your offer with specific modifications to the service agreement. I want formal guarantee that my involvement remains limited to training, consulting, and emergency response within the United States. I also want the right to decline specific assignments that conflict with my psychological assessment of appropriate force levels." General Hayes' response indicated satisfaction with Sarah's decision while acknowledging the complexity of integrating her capabilities into existing military structures. "We can accommodate those requirements, Sarah. When can you begin your transition back to military service?" Sarah looked around her apartment, filled with the simple possessions of civilian life that would soon be replaced by the controlled environment of military housing and classified operations. Give me 2 weeks to arrange transition of my responsibilities at the veterinary clinic and prepare for relocation to whatever facility you have in mind for my training duties. The conversation concluded with logistical details that confirmed Sarah's return to a world she'd hoped never to see again, but under circumstances that offered genuine opportunity to contribute positively while maintaining the psychological boundaries essential to her long-term well-being. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, establishing a precision shooting training program that combined her combat experience with advanced technologies designed to minimize lethal force while maintaining operational effectiveness. The work challenged her professionally while allowing her to maintain the healing focus that had become central to her civilian identity. Her first class of students included special operations personnel, who possessed exceptional basic skills but lacked experience in the kind of precision shooting that had made Sarah legendary among people whose names would never appear in public records. Teaching them techniques that could save American lives while minimizing enemy casualties felt like a worthy application of capabilities she'd once viewed as purely destructive. Amy visited during her first weekend at Fort Bragg, proud of her sister's return to military service while curious about the classified programs that had recruited Sarah back into active duty. "I still can't believe you made those shots at Nellis," Amy said as they walked through the base housing area where Sarah had been assigned temporary quarters. The pilots who were captured said the shooting was unlike anything they'd seen in military training or combat operations. Sarah smiled, remembering the moment when her civilian identity had been shattered by circumstances that forced her to reveal capabilities she'd hoped to keep hidden forever. "I'm just glad you're safe, Amy. Everything else is secondary to that." But Sarah knew that her return to military service represented more than personal sacrifice for family protection. The training program she was developing would improve the capabilities of American special operations personnel, while advancing technologies that could reduce casualties in future conflicts. The precision shooting techniques she taught emphasized accuracy over firepower, psychological preparation over aggressive mindset, and tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine. Her students learned to view their weapons as surgical instruments rather than tools of destruction, a perspective that could save lives on both sides of future conflicts. 6 months after her return to military service, Sarah received recognition for developing training programs that had improved special operations effectiveness while reducing civilian casualties in recent overseas operations. The award ceremony was classified, attended only by personnel with appropriate security clearances, but it represented acknowledgement that her capabilities could serve constructive purposes under appropriate circumstances. General Hayes presented the award with obvious satisfaction at the success of recruiting Sarah back into military service. "Your work has demonstrated that precision shooting capabilities can serve humanitarian purposes when applied with appropriate training and technological support. The techniques you've developed are being adopted throughout Special Operations Command." Sarah accepted the recognition while reflecting on the journey that had taken her from civilian veterinary worker to military instructor, specializing in precision shooting applications that minimized harm while achieving tactical objectives. The work felt consistent with her values while utilizing capabilities that might otherwise have remained dormant. But she also understood that her return to military service had permanently ended the anonymity and simplicity of civilian life. She was once again a person whose existence was classified, whose capabilities were considered national security assets, and whose personal choices were constrained by service obligations that extended far beyond normal military commitments. The evening after the awards ceremony, Sarah called her former supervisor at the veterinary clinic to check on the animals she'd left behind when accepting military service. The conversation reminded her of the healing work she'd abandoned in favor of training people to use violence more effectively, even if that violence was constrained by humanitarian considerations. "We miss having you here," Dr. Martinez said, his voice carrying genuine affection for Sarah's dedication to animal welfare. "The night shift hasn't been the same without someone who understood that healing requires patience and precision." Sarah realized that her current work combined the same patience and precision, applied to training people rather than treating animals. Both roles involved using specialized skills to protect vulnerable creatures from harm, though the methods and contexts were dramatically different. As she prepared for sleep in military housing that felt both familiar and foreign after 3 years of civilian life, Sarah reflected on the choices that had brought her back to a world she'd tried to escape. Her capabilities were being used constructively, her sister was safe, and American personnel were better prepared for threats that required exceptional precision shooting skills. But she also missed the simplicity of civilian life, where her actions were motivated by immediate compassion rather than complex strategic objectives, and where success was measured by individual animals saved rather than military operations completed successfully. The balance between personal values and professional obligations would continue to challenge Sarah as she developed training programs and responded to emergency situations that required capabilities she'd hoped never to use again. But she'd found a way to serve constructively while maintaining the psychological boundaries essential to her long-term well-being. The phone beside her bed rang at 0300 hours, interrupting sleep with the kind of urgent communication that indicated emergency deployment. Sarah answered with the professional alertness that military service had ingrained as automatic response to unexpected contact during sleeping hours. "Sarah, this is General Hayes. We have a situation developing in Germany that requires immediate precision shooting support. Can you be ready for deployment in 2 hours?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with realization that her carefully constructed boundaries between training and combat were about to be tested by circumstances beyond her control. The emergency response clause in her service agreement had been activated, requiring her to provide capabilities that could mean the difference between American lives saved or lost. "What's the situation, General?" Sarah asked, already beginning mental preparation for deployment to circumstances that would challenge everything she'd learned about maintaining psychological sustainability while serving military objectives. The answer would determine whether her return to military service had successfully balanced personal values with professional capabilities, or whether she was about to discover that some choices couldn't be controlled, regardless of formal agreements and carefully negotiated limitations. As she prepared for deployment to Germany, Sarah understood that her transformation from civilian to military operator was about to be tested under conditions that would reveal whether her psychological boundaries could survive contact with the harsh realities of international security threats that required immediate and decisive action. The quiet woman who had driven to Nevada to watch her sister's flight evaluation had become someone whose capabilities were considered essential for protecting American interests worldwide, but at a cost that continued to challenge her fundamental beliefs about violence, service, and the price of exceptional skills in an increasingly dangerous world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.